Vinieron los mercenarios por el único camino, la ensenada de cochinos, cochinos extraordinarios. Por allí vinieron, pero allí quedaron. Por allí vinieron los pobres, pero allí quedaron.
Olá, bem-vindos a mais uma atividade desse sexto Salão do Livro Político, que iniciou no dia 24 de setembro e termina hoje, 3 de outubro de 2021, domingo. Eu sou Ivana Jinques, uma das organizadoras do evento. Com o tema Livros que Gritam, o Salão do Livro Político conta com a participação esse ano de 68 editores independentes. E é uma realização da Boitempo, da Autonomia Literária, da Anita Garibaldi e da Alameda, com a PUC de São Paulo. E conta com o apoio da Fundação Rosa Luxemburgo, João Agabeira, Perseu Abramo, Maurício Grabois e Astrogildo Pereira. E também com o apoio da Casa Rex e das editoras do SESC, Estação Liberdade e Perspectiva. Nós tivemos um curso sobre o fascismo e uma série de debates e entrevistas com alguns dos autores mais importantes na defesa de uma sociedade mais igualitária. E essa programação inteiramente gratuita vai até essa noite. Ela está toda disponível no endereço salãodolivropolitico.com.br. Também nesse endereço vocês encontram a lista das editoras participantes e uma série de títulos com descontos que vão de 20% a 50%. São livros que gritam por democracia, por justiça social, contra o fascismo e a ultradireita. Esses descontos estão no site das próprias editoras, já atribuídos no valor dos livros, ou através do cupom VI Salau, tudo em caixa alta, sexto salão em romano. Essa conversa de hoje entre Flávia, Biroli e Wendy Goldman foi gravada para poder ser apresentada aqui com legendas. Ela está sendo transmitida nos canais do Salão do Livro, da Boitempo, da TV PUC e da TVT, entre outros. Eventuais questões ou sugestões que surgirem aqui no chat serão encaminhadas a elas depois. Esperamos que vocês gostem desse debate, que se inscrevam no canal do Salão do Livro, que difundam vídeos e livros por um mundo melhor e que prestigiem a edição independente. A programação segue e termina hoje à noite com uma conversa sobre a uberização do trabalho. E agora vamos a Flávia, Biroli e Wendy Goldman.
So I want to talk today about some current problems that we're facing globally, and also how these relate to some very radical solutions that were proposed by Bolshevik feminists over 100 years ago. The global pandemic has laid bare two very painful issues, which are also closely connected to each other. The first is a question of class. In the United States and other countries, as businesses, schools, restaurants, and daycare centers shut down, many people began working from home. But society still needed what we call here in English essential workers in order to function. These were not only people who worked in the hospitals, but they were also teachers, delivery workers, bus and truck drivers, garbage collectors, grocery store and postal workers, warehouse workers, and people who work in nursing homes. Many of these essential workers, who are absolutely critical to the functioning of our society, are also the people who are paid the most poorly and who receive the fewest benefits. The second question that was raised by the pandemic was a question of gender. So as the schools shut down, women once again became responsible for the full-time care of children and the household, often when they themselves were trying to do their own salaried jobs remotely. This created a crisis there was a huge collision or conflict between reproductive labor and waged labor. Now, the Bolsheviks in 1917 were the very first to advance a full program to resolve this conflict between reproductive and waged labor. And by reproductive labor, I mean all the labor that involves reproducing and caring for family members, the young, the sick, the old, the household labor that allows waged workers to be fed, clothed, cared for, and also supports those who are too young, too old, too sick, or too disabled to work. This work, which has historically been performed by women for no wages, is also a form of affective or emotional labor. Yet at the same time, it's necessary to every society and every economy. And in a sense, the pandemic has sent us back to a pre-modern rural age when reproductive labor and farm work were not separated. Except now, under modern conditions, childcare has been coupled with waged work that demanded undivided attention to the computer. So the pandemic laid bare the difficulties, I think, of combining waged work and reproductive work by heightening these difficulties to almost undoable proportions. And it also laid bare the class issue of our most essential workers who put their lives on the line, disproportionately fell ill and died, and have still received the least reward for doing so. Now, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they advanced a truly radical agenda for women's emancipation. They had a vision that rested on 4 principles. The first was that women would become independent from men through access to an independent wage. In other words, women would enter the wage labor force. The second was that all household labor and childcare would be socialized. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The third was people would be able to come together and to separate freely on the basis of love and not on the basis of economic considerations. So if people no longer wanted to stay together, they would be free to separate. Everyone would have access to an independent wage, children would be fully supported, and people could come together and separate according to their emotional feelings rather than economics. And then finally, they had the idea that over the long period of time, once all these other aspects of life were in place, then the family as we know it, as constructed by law or by religion, the family would gradually wither away. People would still have strong relationships with each other and with their children, but the family as a unit that was constructed by law would no longer be needed in the same way. In 1920, in addition to this vision that was promulgated through law, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion. Today, I want to just focus a little bit on the socialization of household labor. So that's the labor that's done by women for free. Care of children, washing, cleaning, cooking, care of the elderly and dependents. The idea of the Bolshevik vision was that all of this work would be transferred to the larger economy to be done by waged workers for good wages. People would be able to eat in neighborhood dining halls. They would use laundries. There would be good quality childcare centers. And the people who worked in these establishments, men and women, would be respected and they would receive good wages. So the labor that had been done by women for no wage would be recognized as critical to society. This dream was only partially realized in the Soviet Union. In the 1920s and the 1930s, it could not be fully supported in the context of an underdeveloped, very poor, largely peasant country. Under Stalin, we actually see a partial retreat, so that women did enter the labor force in record numbers, and they entered jobs that were previously reserved only for men. Feminist activists formed what they called at the time regendering brigades. And these brigades went into factories and workplaces. They looked at every single job to determine if that job could be done by women. And many skilled jobs that were previously reserved for men were then opened to women as well, along with professional jobs that required higher levels of education. In addition, with industrialization in the 1930s, a lot of household labor was socialized. There were childcare centers, and there were canteens that were set up for people to eat in. Schools began serving free meals to students. And workplaces and schools took on an important role in food provisioning, especially in providing a subsidized, hot midday meal. Many people ate their main hot meal of the day at work or at school. And this was an enormous help to working families. And actually, it set the routines of many Soviet families well into the 1980s. And it somewhat relieved the great burden of dinner preparation that was mainly taken on by women. At the same time, however, in the 1930s, divorce became much more difficult. That was a big change that occurred under Stalin. And even more, I think, painfully, abortion was recriminalized in 1936. Soviet women reacted very angrily to the prohibition on abortion, but their protests did not change the decision of the Soviet state. Moreover, their subsequent actions showed that repression actually has little effect when it comes to abortion. So initially, the prohibition on abortion produced an increase in the birth rate, but this increase lasted only about 2 years. By 1938, the birth rate again began to drop, and by 1940, it had returned to the same level before the prohibition went into effect. The incidence of abortion remained high even though it was illegal. And by 1939, the abortion rate was higher than it was in 1926 when the operation was safe and legal. The death rate from illegal, botched abortions soared as women went back underground to access illegal abortion. Abortion was then re-legalized in 1955 after pressure from women, doctors, and health officials. But now, 100 years later, the abortion battles are still not over. They're not over in Russia, they're not over in Brazil, and they're not over in the United States. The state of Texas, for example, has just passed a new law criminalizing any abortion that's done after 6 weeks, which makes abortion almost impossible to get because the vast majority of women don't even know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks. Soviet feminists, I think, had a lot to teach us, but there are still old battles that need to be fought again and new problems which need new solutions. And just let me give one example of this. A lot of reproductive labor now in richer countries is being done by migrant labor from women in poorer countries. So women from the global South come to the United States and other wealthier countries, and they work in nursing homes for the elderly, as cleaners and domestic servants, and as nannies for wealthier families. They're forced to leave their own children behind so that they can send home wages. They're paid poorly. They work long hours. This is not a just or a fair solution to the conflict between reproductive and wage labor. So the pandemic has raised the question, why are the most essential jobs in society the least paid and receive the worst benefits? Why is reproductive labor so devalued under capitalism? I think we can find some partial answers in the wonderful work that was done by Soviet feminists so long ago, but globalization, mass migration, women's entrance into the labor force now creates new problems, and I think these will need new solutions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Wendy. It was really very, very interesting to listen to you, having read your work. So I'm very happy to be here and to be able to bring some questions so that we can hear you more about them. So it's really fascinating to think that these issues, these problems that are so acute now with the pandemics, they have been approached from different perspectives along human history. And they have been approached from a radical perspective by the Bolsheviks at a moment when the conflicts between reproductive work and waged work, they were part of a context of changes in political language, political horizons of possibilities. And as you said, we are now facing, in a way, the same problems under new patterns. And at the same time, we do need new solutions that have to do with the fact that these inequalities, they have become even more crude, maybe nude, if we think of gender relations of labor and now the pandemic. So I would really like to hear you speak more about how you see the way the pandemic affected previous inequalities, thinking of these inequalities in national contexts, but also these global inequalities that have to do with how migration and care intersect. Today, you have spoken about how women from the global South work for poor wage and for long hours. And I think it's interesting to think of how the deregulation of labor for national citizens is one side of the coin, and on the other side we have the denial of citizenship, the building of national frontiers as a way to really explore the work of women coming from the global south in really higher levels, tax rates than the work of women who are citizens. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, it would be great to hear you.
Well, I think you've said a lot of, you've talked a lot about the contradictions, and they are true. The pandemic has heightened all of these contradictions, and it's to a certain extent, it's no longer possible to sort of paper it over in a way. It's made a lot of things very, very clear. So on the one hand, we have the situation where we have enormous numbers of migrants who are desperate to escape situations for a whole variety of reasons. Some are climate, some are political, some are from the US has created a destabilization that has also led to the rise of drugs and gangs and all kinds of difficulties. We have, thousands of people at our borders in the South who are desperate to escape situations. And I think that on the other hand, we here in the United States and in other countries as well are extremely dependent on migrant labor. And migrant labor is very, very exploited. And one of the main areas in which it is being exploited, and this was very different from anything that the Bolsheviks encountered at that time, is the area of reproductive labor. So much of that work now in wealthier countries is done by people who are here either temporarily or as migrants who have left families behind. Many are here even illegally doing that work. And when you think about that as a kind of, we now have this global solution, but this is not a solution at all because it rests on the tremendous exploitation, oppression, and emotional damage to women from poorer countries. Those women too have the right to be with their children, and they have the right to, should have the right to work for decent wages and to be with their families. So I think all of these problems have not been solved.
It's so important to have this idea of a solution which rests on tremendous exploitation of specific groups of women. This is not a real solution for a more just world in which gender, class, and race do not mean precariousness of women when they come together, and that's what we see in this current context so clearly. So I wonder if you could speak a little about what a radical care solution could be at this moment, because when we look back to the solutions brought by the Bolsheviks, we had a radical politics in which care was central, at least for a while, as part of the renewal of a project of an equal society. So what would be radical care today? What would be a radical political project in which care is at the center?
Well, I can think of a number of things that would be important. So let's start first with wages. If we truly value this work, and I don't see why we should not value it, our children are the most precious things that we have. And everyone who has a child recognizes that. That is the most precious thing that you will ever have. the people who take care of children should be paid very highly. And in that I include not just people who, let's say, work in daycare centers or who work with small children in nursery schools, but also teachers, people who take care and educate our children. And similarly, our parents, they are precious to us. And when they become old and enfeebled, the people that take care of them should be paid highly and should be trained, and their work should be recognized. So let's just start right there with a high wage and respect for all people who do care work. And that also includes another area, and that has to do with people who do, let's say, cleaning work. That work too should be highly paid, and it should be secure, and it should have all kinds of breaks built into it because it's often physical work. So if we start from that perspective, I would say as just number one point, we could advance quite a bit. Second, if we make that work very highly paid work and respected work, work with dignity, and then create the opportunity for people to have all kinds of establishments that they can use. So for example, my granddaughter now is in a daycare center, and I've seen many, many pictures of the children in it, and they have wonderful facilities for them. And the children are happy. They have toys, they have professional people dealing with them, they have people who have thought a lot about development at different ages and stages. This is a wonderful opportunity, and it's a good place for children. Many of our daycare centers, though, are not like that, or they're extremely expensive and people cannot afford them. So I would say the second thing would be to have high quality, very low cost daycare available to all families that want to use it. It should be close to home, and there should be a close relationship between the parents who are using the center and the people that are working there, something that's very easy for people to use. So I would say that would be the second thing. The third aspect, and this too was something that the Bolsheviks spoke about, is that we can imagine a situation in which we would have excellent, low-cost meals that would be prepared publicly for people to eat at work, to pick up, to take home, to have neighborhood dining facilities where you could take the family after work and see your neighbors and socialize. I have a colleague who grew up in Hungary, and he told me that his mother often would take him and his brothers and sisters to eat in a dining hall after work. And he said that he used to love to go. He saw lots of friends and neighbors, but more importantly, she worked, and it was possible for him to spend time with her when she wasn't tired, stressed out, angry, and upset. And I think that's something too that, you know, if we had that, it would make a huge difference. So these are just a few possibilities here. But I think if we started there, we could realize a lot for people.
And yes, I completely agree with you, and it's very, very important to hear that with such a clarity in times in which public responsibility for care and for people in general is denied, and privatized ways of organizing day-to-day lives are the ones which are stimulated. So what we see, I think we see that around the world in different degrees. And in Brazil at this moment, it's a very important thing, is the denial of the idea that public responsibility is possible, as if it was a question of budget balances and not something that had to do with how we organize society, what we prioritize, what is relevant and precious, as you said, for all of us. And we see that with the pandemic, this has become something even more expressed by our authorities, at the same time that in Brazil, our government, our president denies responsibility for the pandemic. He has been saying many times sentences such as, each one has to take care for its grandpa and its grandma. Each one has its own family. And it's interesting because this comes together with a ultra-conservative rhetoric of defense of the family. And that's my point here. I'd like to, if you could speak a little bit more about that. I know that in the United States, we have similar things. So what's being presented as a defense of the family comes with politics which are actually based on people's insecurities, on the precariousness of work and life. So from a progressive perspective, if we think of the left in a broad perspective, how can we speak of the family, of the value of care, children, in a way that we don't allow them to actually kind of steal these precious ideas and merge them in precariousness, as it has been happening? So if you could just give us your thoughts about that, it would be really great.
Well, we had a very similar set of ideologies and policies under Trump. And things have now, I would say, become a little more normal. Under Trump, it was just disgraceful, shameful, actually, what was happening. He was discouraging people from being vaccinated. He was creating huge racial and other kinds of divisions within society. It was really, really a bad situation. But overall, I would say privatization is an attack on the family. It's a vicious attack on the family. Privatization is very helpful for wealthy people, and they can hire the best services, and they don't do this work themselves. They bring in people to care for their children, to care for their elderly relatives, to care for the sick, to care for people in their family who may be disabled. They don't pay those people much. So they have their own domestic cleaners. They have all of this work they outsource to then people who then they say to those people who have their own families but work long hours a day for their family, why don't you take care of your families? So I see this as it's a class attack on the such a hypocritical and cynical class attack on the people that take care of your family, but their families should have nothing. Their families, their children should run in the streets. Their children should have no care because they then are hired by the wealthy to care for their families. So privatization to me, and the conservative approach is simply an attack on all poor and working families. In other words, the people who actually do the work for the wealthy. we need a solution that works for all families. Just because a woman is poor, it doesn't mean she loves her children any less than a wealthy woman does, or that she wants anything worse for them. She wants the same for them. She wants them to be cared for and loved and to have the best education possible. She wants all those things, and she wants to spend time with them. So we need a solution, I think, that works for all women all around the world and doesn't take women from one region, fly them thousands of miles to another region, to work in a situation where they then see their own children maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and their wages are necessary so that their children will not starve. That privatization has no solution for that.
Yes, of course. And when you mentioned the context of the pandemic and the fact that schools and daycare, they had their activities interrupted. I don't know if you've heard about that, but Brazil was the country of the world in which a greater number of children and teenagers had no school, not remote or presential school, between March 2020 and February 2021. So as a consequence, or at least one of them, we now have a throwback in women's participation in labor waged force of 30 years. It went back to 1991. And I keep thinking of how these women, it's not only that they lost their jobs, they couldn't keep them, or they couldn't try to look for another job. So in a way, it's as if they were put between a very hard choice. They could either take care of their children who were not going to school, who did not have someone to care for them, or work and bring the resources they need to raise their children. So it's not actually a real effective alternative, because they do need to work, most of them. So I think how caring for children brings with it a cost, which makes women, poor women in Brazil, Black women, live in a very precarious situation. And I think of how this is materially, it's precarious in material terms, but also kind of in existential terms, because as you said, they are seen as irresponsible mothers anyway. If they go to work and leave their children uncared, they will be seen as irresponsible. If they do not work, like waged work, and to bring money home, they are still seen as irresponsible in some way. So shouldn't we discuss responsibility in other terms, from other perspectives? What can we learn from the Bolshevik experience in which concerns responsibility? We spoke a little about public responsibility and public alternatives, but I think we are living in times in which this is so important to bring back other perspectives concerning responsibility, to put aside the idea that individuals are always self-responsible, as if the context in which they make their choices did not exist. So if you could comment on that, it would be great.
I think that women have been placed now today in an impossible situation. And you spoke about that very well. On the one hand, they are sort of expected to work. And on the other hand, there has been, and the pandemic really laid this bare, there's no provision for caring for children. So teachers, I know here in the United States, tried very, very hard to reach children remotely and in other ways, but that's not a substitute for going to school. And it was very, very difficult. It was hard for teachers, I think, to keep track of all their children in the classroom. Children would frequently turn off their computers. Teachers didn't know what was happening. Parents were often having to go to work and leave children at home. So these were all very difficult situations, and women are constantly being blamed. They're blamed for not working and being lazy. They're blamed for not caring for their children because they're working. So situations that are socially created, instead, we have an individual kind of blame that is then allocated. And I think as women, we have to start rejecting that. We have to reject that blame, especially when it is laid on us by wealthy men and politicians. And we have to start thinking about devising solutions that make sense for all women. I think the Bolsheviks did a pretty good job, at least of understanding that if women were going to enter the wage labor force, they needed to have a variety of options and opportunities for childcare. And there were all kinds of childcare situations that were created. So, for example, during World War II, when men went off to war and women entered the factories, all women were working in some way. There were childcare centers that functioned 24 hours a day as women worked various shifts. It was possible to leave children in a childcare center and pick them up on weekends. So there were many, many flexible options for this. There were also options, and this of course was true after the war, because during the war it was a crisis situation, but after the war there was good maternity leave. I think many women want to spend time with their babies after they're born. In the United States, people have 3 months of unpaid maternity leave. That's ridiculous. A 3-month-old should be with the mother. And I think that we could do much better with this. I don't know what the laws are in Brazil, but again, I think that you asked me about solutions. I think it would be wonderful if both parents actually could have maternity and paternity leave, maybe up to 3 years old, 3 years of this between them, so that they could spend time with young children and then come back into the workforce at the same level, the same job that they had before, and also be able to put children in high quality care at any age where they wanted to, for any number of hours. So this would make a huge difference. But these are solutions that I think have to be public. And frankly, I cannot imagine them being adopted under societies where the main motive is profit. Under that kind of a situation, I think only the wealthy are going to have opportunities to be able to work, live comfortably, and to feel as if they don't have to worry about their children.
Yes, of course. And you asked about the laws in Brazil. Yeah. We have the right to paid leave for mothers for 4 to 6 months. It depends on the kind of employment, and only 1 week for fathers. But effectively, this is not available to every woman and man, because we have a very high level at the moment of informal work. So, the unemployment rates now in Brazil are over 14%. Among Black women, they reach 21%. And among the employed, the waged workers, we have a very high percentage of informal workers, and this has been actually growing with the pandemic. So this means that the law is not really effective for most people. And this has to do with the fact that maternity can be a kind of burden, at the same time that women are really judged different according to their race, their class, but what we see is that they live motherhood in ways that have to do with what they have available, their context, their conditions. And when we speak of how motherhood is differently lived, differently experienced, we could think of abortion as well, right, Wendy? So you mentioned the new Texas law and the situation in the States. And in Brazil, abortion is a crime except for 3 situations: when the pregnancy is the result of violence, of rape, when there is a risk of death for the mother, and when there is a fetal anencephaly. These are the 3 exceptions to the criminalization. But what we see now is a very open attack against the possibility for women to be able to have an abortion under these 3 cases. Yeah. So this is, it's interesting because there are no effective conditions for mothers to take care of their children, but at the same time, there is a real backlash against the possibility of abortion in cases which are actually part of our laws. So how do you see this backsliding in the conditions to be able to get an abortion in the United States, and all these disputes concerning reproductive rights around the world today? Why is this going on under these patterns? What do you think?
I think part of it is due to the religious right wing. What's interesting about that, though, is that, the Catholic Church, at one point, up through the Middle Ages, actually believed that abortion was okay before quickening. In other words, it was before the mother could actually feel the fetus. Now we're at 6 weeks. They are just trying to chip away more and more and more at this right. So partly I think it's the extreme conservatism of religious authorities, but I also think it has something to do with control. This very powerful patriarchal desire, need to control women's ability to make decisions about their own bodies. There is something very threatening about that to patriarchy. And in a way you can see why, because that ability to make a decision about whether or not you will bear a child is fundamental to women's independence, autonomy, and very selfhood. It is the most fundamental right. The idea that women should be forced to bear children is something that goes against, I think, what every woman knows in her heart to be wrong. Because women know that it's not just a question of carrying a child, but they also think to themselves, how will I care for this child once it's born? So the joke here in the United States is that the right-wing politicians believe that life begins at conception, but it ends at birth. In other words, once the baby's actually there, they couldn't care less about whether that baby is cared for, who will care for it, how it will be cared for, whether it will grow up in poverty and need with a mother that cannot care for it, none of that matters. What matters is the fetus. And that's crazy. So, we're still fighting these battles now. It's 100 years later, and we're still fighting this battle.
Yes, it's what we have seen in Latin America and in Brazil in particular is a backlash in which the right to an abortion is at the center, as it was prior to this backlash. But now we really see a reaction against any attempt to think of gender roles in a equal way. Like the fundamentals of gender equality are being put in check. But at the same time, fortunately, these debates, they are now everywhere. Wendy, in Brazil, in Latin America, feminist movements have been very capable of setting this agenda in a radical critical perspective, with the feminist strikes and the fight against violence. So it's interesting to see how resistance is bringing a critic of violence together with a critique of capitalism, and reproductive rights are, of course, at the center of this fight as well. So, but if you allow me a last question, I'd like to ask you if you could give us some comments on a very different thing. I'm part of a Brazilian network of, sorry, let me start again because they are going to edit, so it's fine. So, Wendy, I'm part of a Brazilian network of women scientists in Brazil. And we are trying to make women scientists' work more visible, and at the same time to approach in critical ways the very difficult patterns of accommodation between academic work, productivity, and family, motherhood, dimensions of life which have to do with reproductive work, social reproduction. So I know we are in many ways in a very privileged role perspective in terms of class, but gender does make a difference in academic life. So would you have any comment concerning that? Do you think that this radical approach that we have been learning from the Bolsheviks could tell us something about how we could deal with sexism and this distance between reproductive work and academic work nowadays?
This is a very difficult question, and it's really hard for women. I mean, it's hard for women academics, and I can speak about this personally. I raised 2 children at a time when I was trying to get tenure and to become, a full part of my department. When I first began working, there were not that many women in the universities and in academia. And I think it was even harder for women in the sciences because they had to spend long hours in the labs. And as a result, it was very hard for them to combine science work with motherhood. As a matter of fact, my closest friend in college, she was remarkable. She got a PhD in biology. She got a very, very good job in a university after she got her PhD, and she had funding for an elaborate lab. She was expected to spend 12 hours a day in that lab, 6 days, 7 days a week, and then she had a baby. And she ended up having to leave the sciences. And I think things maybe are better for women now, but it was really, really hard. So I think the only solution here, and I would say, I think things are getting better, at least from what I have seen at my university among the younger men, is that men are taking on more responsibilities to allow women, I think, to do the kind of work that is required in the sciences. At the same time, though, I think we also maybe have to start reconsidering the hours that are demanded from both male and female scientists. Similar kinds of hours are demanded from doctors, I think, and there are other professions as well where the flexibility is perhaps not as great as it is in the humanities. And much more needs to be done, but I don't expect this to be done under capitalism. But much more needs to be done to reconsider what here we call a work-life balance. And this is true for all jobs and occupations. I know when I spoke to people in Brazil, they described to me a lot of people live in outer suburbs that ring the cities. They often have commutes of 2 hours to come in. Then they put in 8 hours a day and then 2 hours more to get back home. That's 12 hours in which you are not at home with a family. That's wrong. So, you know, here we're talking about other kinds of issues about public transportation, issues about a number of hours that people are forced to work, the ways in which society as a whole thinks about work. And this is just getting worse, not better. The expectations for work, I think, in every single area, from manual work all the way through mental work, is just that you should be involved with work 24 hours a day. And that's not a prescription for a healthy life for families or for women or for men or for anybody.
Of course. And if you think of how this connects to waged domestic work, because many of us around the world then end up having to rely on paid domestic work of other women who are generally poorly paid, Black women. So I'm saying, and generally that's how the arrangements are in a country like Brazil, not because of immigration, because of internal inequalities and how they end up producing a gendered division of work, which is racialized and of course has to do with class inequalities as well. So Wendy, I want to thank you very much. I think we have spoken of many issues, and I particularly enjoyed hearing your approach of our possible solutions and how a radical care language could be part of a radical political project, as I have put myself, but I really loved your comments on that. And I'd like to know if you'd like to say anything just to end our moment here.
It's my hope that women everywhere will organize, because you and I, Flavia, can talk and we have ideas, and ideas are important. And I hope people will hear our ideas. But the truth is, until we all get together and really make it impossible for the system to move forward without us, to organize together, to organize collectively, I don't think that much is possible. Nothing will be done. And women will continue to suffer in all kinds of ways. So I take heart in the fact that You're a member of an organization of women scientists, and especially all of the young women everywhere who are organizing around the abortion question and around other issues too. I do feel that there's so much energy now and so much, women have tasted freedom. And I think that once you taste freedom, it's very, very hard to go back from that. So it's my hope that we will see a lot of organizing in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
So, and thank you. Thank you for your questions. And I have enjoyed our conversation a great deal.
Oh, I've enjoyed a lot our conversation as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I think